Gary, thank you so much for coming to us today and for engaging in a very broad discussion. Now, for the benefit of our members, you raised a very interesting point. You said that even if we do have a deal with Iran, it will carry some significant drawbacks, which are very often ignored by the public. Would you like to tell us what they are?
Sure. I think there are three big potential downsides of the deal that's being negotiated. One is just within the United States, the deal will be very controversial, and that will lead to a very difficult fight between the White House and Congress. And there's at least a possibility that Congress will overrule an agreement, which of course would be very damaging to the credibility of the president and to U.S. foreign policy. I think it's unlikely, but a lot of energy will be committed to defending an agreement if it ever emerges. Secondly, in the region itself, a deal will mean the lifting of sanctions, which means that the Iranian government will have more revenue available. And this is at a time when at least some in Iran are claiming that they're in an ascendant position in Syria and Iraq and Yemen and Lebanon and so forth. And that's going to mean the U.S. will have to manage our allies and friends in the region, Israel, Saudi, Jordan, and so forth, because they'll be very nervous that a deal will unleash Iranian power. And third, any agreement will recognize and legitimize Iran having a domestic enrichment program. And that means that every other country in the region will claim the same right. Now, it'll be difficult for them to actually exercise that right unless they get a lot of foreign technical assistance, but we will have crossed a threshold in terms of recognizing that countries in the Middle East can claim to have a fuel cycle program for their domestic nuclear power industry.
I think, that particular concession in that sense is an important one. This ability to have a domestic enrichment program, which I know is sometimes commented on by Iranian commentators in particular, has been something that they've only been prevented from happening since the revolution in 1979, and that prior to that it was basically the West was always very was very helpful in facilitating the growth of a domestic civil nuclear program, including enrichment. But in actual fact, that was never the case. At least since 1974, since the India went nuclear, the West and actually all the nuclear suppliers have been very keen to restrict the capacity for enrichment. And so this would actually in some ways be quite an achievement for Iranian negotiators, particularly in light of what's been happening at the UN Security Council, and the original intention was obviously to have zero enrichment, and now we're having a situation where a sort of a compromise would certainly have to be sought. I'm surprised myself that the Iranians themselves don't make more of this concession, because I think, historically speaking, it's not insignificant. Let me put it that way. It's not insignificant.
I was wondering, Gary, is there, on the domestic front in the United States, a positive outcome for the president here? Because he's in the fight of his life. It looks like if Menendez goes to the floor, it's got a good chance of passing. If the negotiations stall a little bit, then Congress comes into play, the Senate comes into play. Has he got the strength, do you think, to be able to back domestic opposition?
Well, the president was able to convince Congress to at least postpone a vote on Kirk-Menendez in order to allow for some time to try to complete a political framework agreement by the end of March. And I think the Democrats in particular were persuaded that it made sense to allow the president a few more months. If a political framework agreement is produced that passes muster, that looks credible, then I think Obama will be in a strong position to argue in favor of further delays for Kirk-Menendez in order to allow the negotiators more time. But if a political framework is not produced, which I think looks quite likely at this point, I think the White House will be in a much weaker position to block Kirk-Menendez. And in fact, I think and I hope the president decides to support Kirk-Menendez at that point in order to increase pressure on Iran, but also to try to modify the legislation so it gives the president a little bit more flexibility in terms of implementation, for example, by extending the period of the waiver.
Ali, I wonder, how cognizant are the Iranians of Obama's dilemmas here? Do you think the Supreme Leader is really interested in the kind of trials and tribulations that Obama has got to go through to push a deal forward? Or do you think he's sitting back and just letting this whole scenario play out?
One of the striking things for me has really been how little people in Iran seem to understand, certainly those decision makers, seem to understand political processes in the United States as well as in Europe. They expect changes to be made far more quickly than is actually mechanically, if I can put it that way, procedurally possible. I think there is a recognition, certainly in some of the policy-making circles, that Obama has gone out on a limb, and that Obama is basically combating Congress in the respect. As we've discussed, in a way, it's part of a narrative in the sense that they want to say that, look, the blame, if there is blame for failure at the end of the day, is not to be laid at the White House's door. It could be at Congress, so on and so forth. So I think there is a recognition that in political terms, Obama represents a window of opportunity. What they haven't really got to grips with, and I would say that the further away you get from policy circles, more into the Supreme Leader's office, it's more stark, this gap in knowledge, if I can put it that way, that they haven't really fully understood the procedures of policy-making, legislation and other things in Western governments. In Western sort of highly bureaucratic, democratic systems which require a degree of consultation and agreement. And often these can be, pushed backwards and forwards between various committees before anything is actually settled. So I think one of the worries has to be, in terms of their negotiating position, has been a failure to build into that position an understanding of the mechanics of government in the West.
Gary, can I ask you, if June comes, we have no framework of any kind, would it be credible for the administration to ask for another extension, or 2 extensions that are enough and it would be difficult?
I think it's getting more and more difficult to justify further extensions as it becomes more and more clear that a comprehensive agreement really isn't in the cards, because the Supreme Leader is not prepared to meet minimum U.S. demands. The only way I think a further extension is politically possible is if new sanctions legislation allows the president to waive the sanctions for some period of time. And the Kirk-Menendez bill already has built into it a 1-month waiver, but I could imagine the White House, in exchange for supporting the bill, could seek a 6-month waiver. And then that's what we're living under now. The president's waiving the current sanctions on a 6-month basis. So I could imagine Obama deciding to keep the process going 6 months at a time, and then the question would be whether the Iranians reciprocate. My reading of the Iranian position is that they would prefer to keep the status quo in place, because they're getting a respite from sanctions without having to make big nuclear concessions. And at least for the time being, I suspect they'd be willing to go along with the status quo.
But wouldn't an eventual success, whatever success means, wouldn't an eventual success depend on the Americans persuading Tehran that this is not a process in itself, that the negotiations, if they achieve nothing, should not become a process in itself? So wouldn't that therefore require some cutoff that is at least understandable and credible?
Well, I've always thought that these negotiations would never come to a conclusion unless there was a real deadline, a hard deadline, because the Iranians naturally are avoiding making very difficult decisions. But the fact of the matter is, the Obama administration would be comfortable extending the status quo through the rest of his term, because he's got a lot of other problems to deal with in the Middle East, as well as around the world, and a collapse of the nuclear negotiations would complicate everything, especially the campaign against Islamic State, which is likely to heat up this year. So I think Obama, if he can figure out a way to keep the process in place for the next year and a half, would be quite happy to do that, and then leave it up to the next president to decide whether to set a hard deadline with an ultimatum. And the question then will be whether the Iranians are willing to live with this kind of, continuing rollover of the status quo for the next year and a half. I don't know what you think.
I mean, there seems to be, I think, a conviction in the Supreme Leader's office that one would one would be able to survive and live with the rollover up to a point of status quo. Although I have to say, obviously the sanctions regimes as it is not doing much good for Iranian business or the Iranian economy. But it seems to be that certain people in leadership positions are shielded from the worst consequences of that. So there is a distinct possibility. I mean, it has to be seen what happens to the economy in general. I mean, if the economy in general in Iran keeps nosediving, particularly with the oil price being what it is at the moment, then there are going to be other pressures onto them to move. But it seems to be that there are, yes, I think a group, unfortunately those in decision-making positions, who are quite prepared for this to agonisingly continue on for some time. And I think we just have to be, it's very unfortunate for the Iranian people themselves that they have to live under this very difficult circumstance.
Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.